Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and one of the hardest planes to get a grasp on in Flight Sim 2024 is the Draco. So today we're going to look at a few things we can do to handle it better, from controls to understanding how beta works, managing takeoff, and avoiding the dreaded ground loop. First off, the best way to get a grasp on any plane that you're struggling with, not just the Draco, is to go to an airfield where you're comfortable doing pattern work, because there's no way around it. This is really one of those planes that just needs a lot of practice. I'm using Kern Valley for today because I'm pretty familiar with it, and even though it is a bit of a tight space, there are a couple of landmarks to make it easy to time your pattern, but any place that you feel comfortable is fine too. The other thing I'd say is that it's best to practice without any wind first, so either you find somewhere with calm winds or you use a preset instead, and then you can add the wind back in once you start to feel more comfortable with it. Now, the insane power of the Draco comes from its turboprop PT6 engine, and to handle it properly, you'll want to make sure that your controller's axes are set up so that you can easily change your power settings as you go around the circuit. Ideally, you'll want 3 free axes, one for the throttle, another for the prop, and a final one for the condition lever. But if you only have 2, that's not really a problem either, and I'd prioritize the throttle and the prop in that case. You can use the condition lever axis binding to move the lever from the cutoff position right at the bottom of the axis to the low idle position near the middle, and then the high idle position right at the top. If you don't have an axis to spare for it, then I'd set a key to the increase and decrease condition lever bindings instead, so that you can toggle it up and down between the 3 positions easily. Although, as we're going to see here, I tend to use the low idle position most of the time anyways. Moving on to the propeller lever now, if we bind that up to the propeller 1 axis, it'll let you move it through most of its range of motion, but you'll notice that it doesn't go into the feather position at the bottom of the axis. The feather position is something you typically only use if you had an engine failure to allow it to windmill, so you're not too likely to need it, and you can move it there manually with the mouse if you really need to. The other option, if you have a honeycomb Bravo, is to assign the button on the reverse part of the axis to the increased prop pitch binding, and that'll allow you to put it in the feather position as well. Let's move on to the throttle now, and because this is a turboprop engine, we not only have forward thrust, we also have the beta and reverse range, which I'll explain in just a bit, and to make sure that you can access it, we have to do a few things to our bindings. First off, you'll want to make sure that your throttle lever is bound to the normal throttle 1 axis, and once that's set up, if you move the throttle to the bottom of the range, it'll make it stop at the flight idle position. To get it to go into beta and reverse, the easiest thing to do is to bind a key to toggle the axis into reverse thrust. So for example, on my Bravo throttle, I've bound the go around button on the throttle to be the toggle reverse thrust binding. Like that, once I bring the throttle back to idle and I press the button, the forward motion of the axis now moves the throttle through the beta range and into reverse, so it makes it quick and easy to access the entire range of the throttle lever. We're going to look at how to use the beta range properly in just a bit, but before we can do that, we need to go through our startup flow, which isn't overly complicated, but there are some subtleties that you should know about. First off, we have a few things to turn on, like our battery switch to give us some electrical power, and then our avionics can come on too, so that we have access to our instruments that we need for engine start. And finally, we'll turn our beacon lights on as well, because we're going to be getting underway soon anyways. We can also check that our fuel tank selector is set to both. However, there is a bug with that at the moment where it still only feeds from 1 tank, so you'll want to remember to switch the tank during flight from time to time until that's fixed. Next, our fuel pumps on the left and right can come on too, and to get ready to start the engine, we'll make sure that our prop is pushed full forward, and most importantly, the condition lever has to be set to the cutoff position. That prevents any fuel from getting to our engine and potentially creating conditions for a hot start where the ITT exceeds its limit on engine start. But to be fair, I'm not actually sure if this is actually modeled because I haven't been able to force one no matter what I try. With all of that set correctly though, we're pretty much ready to get it started now. So we'll turn our auto ignition on first, and then we can put the starter, which is just next to it, on as well. And right after that, you'll hear the engine start motoring, which we'll let it do until it's stabilized at about 19% N1. At that point, we can introduce our fuel by moving the condition lever to the low idle position, which will light off our engine, and we're going to see the N1 and the ITT start to rise. Even though it seems unlikely to happen, you should still keep an eye on the ITT so that it doesn't exceed the engine start limit, which I believe is the top end of the yellow band. And if it gets close to there, you'll want to bring your lever back to the cutoff position so that you avoid damaging your engine. Once the N1s reach 50% though, we can turn the starter back to off, and then our generator can come on to provide our electrical power. And the last thing to do is to turn the pitot heat on so that our instruments get the right readings in flight. There are a couple other little details that you could do as well, like if you're flying in cold and wet weather, you'll want to consider turning the de-icing on if you're below 5 Celsius, but for the most part, this should do the trick. Taxiing in this plane is actually a bit hard because of how much power the engine actually has relative to the weight of the plane, and the moment that you release the parking brakes, it'll start to get underway on its own without any throttle. For that reason, you'll want to keep the condition lever in the low idle position that we left it after engine start, because the problem is even more amplified if you put it into high idle. Even at low idle, it picks up a ton of speed, and you can obviously use the brakes to slow down, but we also have the beta range to help us, and what it does is it actually changes the angle of the prop blades to produce less thrust and slow us down. What we'll do then is operate the throttle exactly like I showed earlier, and we'll go slightly into the beta range, and you'll see that our ground speed drops off pretty quickly after that. All turboprops have a beta range like this because of how much thrust they produce at flight idle. It would make it a little bit too difficult to taxi out without having to ride the brakes, and the problem's even more amplified with the Draco because of how lightweight it actually is. One thing that's a bit different with the Draco from other turboprops is that normally you should be able to keep it in beta to taxi at a lower speed, but it brings you to a complete stop the moment you even go slightly into the beta range. So you have to keep moving the throttle in and out of there to keep your speed under control. As you've seen here a couple times now, the way I tend to do it is that I'll apply beta for about a second or two, just enough to slow us down. And the big advantage to doing it this way is that you don't have that forward lurch that you get when you tap the brakes. When it comes to takeoff, the Draco is definitely pretty unique, but again, once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy, and we'll actually start by just turning our landing lights on, and we'll also switch our nav lights into the strobe position. We'll also look over just to our left to set the flaps for takeoff, and the next thing that we need to talk a little bit about is the trim, because as far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be any trim indicator anywhere in the cockpit. The only way that I've found to see the trim position is to go into the menus and bring up the HUD in cockpit view, and then when you back out of there, right at the bottom, you'll be able to see it, but I don't really like the way that looks, even though it did help me to realize that the takeoff trim position is actually just fully nose down. Once you know that though, you don't really need the HUD anymore, because to set your trim for takeoff, even when you're doing pattern work and a lot of takeoffs and landings, all you need to do is hold your trim down binding for a couple of seconds, and that'll bring it back to full nose down, and you should be all set. When it comes to the condition lever, you can put it in high idle for takeoff if you really want, but honestly, other than if you're flying at really high elevation, like in Colorado, Idaho, or something like that, I tend to leave it in low idle because it really doesn't need it otherwise. Now, normally you would want to backtrack along the runway to give yourself plenty of room for takeoff, but again, the stall features of the Draco mean that you can just take off from almost any intersection so long as you have about 200 to 300 feet ahead of you. Once you're in position and you're ready, takeoff in this plane is definitely a bit different than anything else you've ever flown, and you'll want to pull back on the stick completely aft and hold it there as you get going. Then from there, you can bring the power up to about 25% just to bring the prop up to speed for a second or so, and then after that, push it forward to about 75%, and the moment that you get airborne, you'll want to slowly release that back pressure that you were holding. From there, the lightness and power of the plane should make quick work of any obstacles, so you don't really have to worry about V-speeds on this plane. You can let the plane stabilize till you're about 500 feet above the ground, and at that point you can bring the flaps up, and you'll see your airspeed's gonna pick up a fair bit after you do that. For going around the pattern, I bring the power back to 40% for the climb, and then 25 to 30% once I level off, which should give me about 100 knots throughout, which feels about right to me. The other thing you'll notice is our RPM is often in the red, so it's not a bad idea to just bring the prop lever back a bit to about 1800 RPM or so, which will work quite nicely. Clicking on the screen itself will actually make your main engine instruments bigger, especially the RPM and the ITT, and you should probably use this view for takeoff and landing to make it a little bit easier to see. When you do that, you also get a lot more details about your fuel, your oil, and even your takeoff and landing distances, which is pretty cool to look at, and it's an easy way to practice making each one better than the last. Now, when it comes to landing, the number one thing everyone wants to avoid with the Draco is the ground loop once you hit the ground, but the key to that is actually all about preparation and managing your airspeed and descent rate. As you get close to the end of your downwind leg, you'll want to have the torque set to about 15%, which will bring your airspeed down to 90 knots or so, and at that point you can bring the flaps down to the takeoff position. I'm not actually sure what the flaps extension speeds are in this plane, and it's very hard to find any information about it because it's basically a prototype, but I haven't had any notifications about damage when doing it this way, so I'm just rolling with it. The takeoff flaps will bleed off a fair bit of airspeed, and I find that it's best to bring the power back up to about 20% to maintain around 60 knots, and I know that sounds slow, but once you get the hang of it, you'll be able to slow down a little bit later on in the pattern. This is actually why for your first few patterns I really recommend just giving yourself about a mile or two on final until you get more comfortable with all of the power adjustments that it needs, and then you can tighten up your circuit a little bit more. Now that we've done our base turn though, I'm just keeping an eye on the runway and I'm slowly starting to descend, but because we're flying so slowly we can really take our time with it, and 400 to 500 feet per minute is all it'll take even if you're still at pattern altitude, because I like to be a little bit high on the approach with this plane. As you roll out on final, you'll want to make sure to be at flaps full, and this is where I'm targeting to be at about 50 knots, which should still be about a 20% torque setting. Any speed change in this plane requires the tiniest adjustments to the throttle though, because even a 2% change in torque can result in the 5-knot difference. The other thing to remember is that since this is a turboprop, power changes take a couple of seconds to take effect, so there's a natural tendency to add in more power than you actually need. In a way, you kind of have to anticipate the power changes because of that input lag to the throttle, which really only comes with practice and experience. We want to be as stable as possible as we get close to the ground, which means we have to have a stable descent rate, generally around 500 feet per minute or so, and about here is where I start to slow down towards 45 knots, so again, a tiny power change. It requires very little runway to come to a complete stop though, so don't feel like you have to hit the touchdown zone too precisely for now. All you want to do here is just practice getting it on the ground in a stable configuration. When you're about 50 feet above ground, slowly bring the power back to idle so that you touch down just above 35 knots, and that'll give you a little bit of margin for error with the stall speed. If you land too much faster than that, you're at a much higher risk of ground looping, and even then, for the first few feet once I've touched down, I don't touch the brakes, the rudder, or even go into beta, because all of these will quickly send you spinning. After it's stabilized on the ground though, you should be good to go into beta and bring yourself to a nice slow taxi speed to head back to the terminal. And if you learned something useful today, please make sure to like the video and subscribe on your way out.